panel with us today four, um, well, hard to characterize them in one term, recent grads or students who are actively engaged in this space of receiving communities, the theme of our workshop today. And you heard from Ira that two have worked directly with adaptation leaders work, and two others, one recent master's graduate and another master's student, Nikki and Jacob, have actively worked on these issues from an urban and regional planning perspective. Fernando coming from the legal perspective, and Brianna as an undergraduate in our Elliott School here at GW. So nice wide range of perspectives, and excited to hear from them. And we'll start things off with Fernando, an LLM in International Environmental Law graduate here at GW.
Thanks, Dinabade. I'm really happy to be here. Good morning to everyone. Well, first I have to say that this event means a lot to me because it gathers two of my homes in Washington, D.C. Because obviously I studied here my Master's of Law degree at GW Law, but also Adaptation Leader, that is the co-organizer of this event, was the first organization that opened the doors for me in a professional way in Washington, D.C. When I was a student, it was one of the first job opportunities that I applied to a research position, and I was lucky enough to get it. So therefore, this event, well, I feel home right now. So when Adaptation Leader gave me my first tasks, it was to do a research about the legal authorities on climate displacement, focusing on receiving communities. And I started to do a lot of research, and I found something that won't be shocking to you. That is, there's few legal authorities on this subject, especially in the federal level. I remember a seminar of GW that we had, where we had one speaker from Colombia, Professor Camila Bustos, and she mentioned, I think one of the persons assisting here is from Colombia, right? And she mentioned how in Colombia, the situation of the cartels that they had in Colombia caused a lot of people to move, to be displaced from one place to another. And she mentioned how, interestingly, they had to include provisions in the Constitution of Colombia regulating that displacement by danger and danger of the cartels, the danger and the terrible situation that they were causing. And years later, the Constitutional Court of Colombia recognized that to regulate climate displacement. So that framework was used also in Colombia to regulate climate displacement. So they had constitutional provisions, federal provisions, well, national there in Colombia. If that were the case in the US, my work would have been so much easier. But obviously it's not. While it is true that there is not a binding and express legal provisions, legislation that regulate this matter, we do have some baby steps, I like to call it, and some important first steps. So for instance, first we have reports and we have guidelines created by the federal government, by the White House and by the federal agencies, especially in the last administration. So for instance, we have a report on the impact of climate change on migration issued in October 2021. The report was issued by the White House, and it was the first, or one of the first instruments that recognized, that linked at the federal level climate change and migration. It is the first time, or one of the first times, that a document recognizes this link. That is a first important step. The second step, the second guide instrument that I want to bring to the table is the Climate Resilience Implementation Guide, issued by the Department of Housing and Urban Development in April 2023. So that report brings an important conclusion. And it makes a question: what is the best strategy to address climate migration? And the answer is to support the relocation of the communities, that it has to be voluntarily, I mean, it has to be in coordination with the people that is moving, but not also that, says the report, but also to coordinate with the receiving communities. So we have a new element, the first recognition of receiving communities as an important and fundamental part in the climate displacement strategies and programs. Then we have a recent report, the report on opportunities for federal support on community-driven relocation, that's issued on December 2024. It's super recent. And for me, the most important part of that report is that it analyzes some local programs where people have been relocated in local communities by local governments, municipalities, and from all those first steps of local governments, it makes an 8-step approach, an 8-step strategy to determine whether there should be relocation of people or no. And that 8 steps are supposed to be a guideline or a first step for a future federal strategy. The first step is determining if relocation is really necessary. It has to be basically the last measure when there's few alternatives. And the step that I want to bring to the table is the third step. That means selecting a relocation site. Would it have to be in the same place, in the same state, in the same community? Would you have to move people to a different state? That's an important question. You're affecting people's right of property, one of the most important rights in the United States, definitely, right? So how do you handle that? And the report, again, recognizes the importance of handling the people that is moving, but also the receiving communities. So you have to have the consent, not only of the people that are being displaced, but also of the people that are receiving these displaced migrants, climate migrants. So from these 3 reports of the White House, of the executive branch, we notice that at least the last administration was conscious of the importance of the consent and the considerations of the receiving communities. Because at the end, Adaptation Leader is an NGO that focuses on, yes, climate displacement, but with a focus on receiving communities. Finally, that's when we're talking about the executive branch. We also see some instances of federal legislation by Congress that can be applied in some way or is related in some way to climate displacement. For instance, in regards to funding, we have the National Housing and Community Development Act of 1975. And throughout this act of Congress, the federal government has already funded local, in coordination obviously with local communities, with local governments, has already funded displacement of small communities from one place to another due to climate change reasons. So we have at least local precedents with federal support. We also have the bipartisan infrastructure law that also regulates and has a section that allows the government to fund relocation of climate migrants. And finally, there's the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policies Act. This is an important act because it intends to ensure that people that are being displaced are treated in an uniform, fair, and equitable manner. Now, I don't know if it's totally clear if the provisions of this act would apply to climate displacement, but I think it can function as a precedent. And at some point, it's a law that establishes a good framework that, with an amendment or with certain interpretations, could serve as a base to treat climate migrants and receiving communities in a uniform, fair, and equitable manner. We have to remember that these kind of situations affect property rights, a fundamental right in U.S. law and in democracies, and therefore every strategy, every legislation has to consider the consent, the opinions and the will of the people, both that are being displaced and the people that receive these communities. I used to, every time that I used to give a presentation, I used to finish with a lawyer joke, but people told me to stop because the non-lawyers in the room didn't get it, and the lawyers didn't find them funny. So, thank you.
Thank you, Fernando, for setting the stage so nicely, with or without the lawyer joke. Certainly better informed about the landscape for this very important issue. So thank you. It's always a proud moment when our graduates go on to do great things immediately upon graduation, and Fernando's living proof of that. And he had an article published while he was here as an LLM student with us in a very prestigious environmental law journal, and he's going to continue to go on to do great things in his career, and just really happy to have you with us today. And another proud GW moment is we have another GW grad from the Master's Program in Sustainable Urban Planning, who will be speaking next. Nidhi, your turn.
Thank you, Dean Abate. I'd like to start by thanking GW Law and the Media Alliance and adaptation leaders for putting together this opportunity. I was talking to Donna earlier about how it feels like climate migration and the discussion around it is moving full steam ahead. And when I started doing my research almost 2.5 years ago now, it felt like I was pulling at strings to get people to talk to me and be able to share what they're learning and what they're hearing about. When I talked about climate migration, a lot of the cities were kind of just like, what is that? Like the planners were like, we don't really understand what that is yet. And in the past year and seeing everyone in this room that's like working on this and doing such great work, I'm really excited by it, and it feels like home to be able to be surrounded by so many people working on this great topic. I'm going to keep it brief because I think a lot of you already know a lot of the conversation, but I graduated from the Sustainable Urban Planning Program at GW last summer, and I did my capstone on receiving communities and the role of planners specifically in the climate migration context. As you all know, climate change is making relocation inevitable for millions globally, and depending on the study parameters in the US, it's looking like anywhere from 1 to 10 people to 1 to 2 Americans are having to move as a response. So this is a substantial shift. Whether voluntary or forced, people are moving, and receiving communities need to start preparing and thinking about how they're going to accommodate the needs of incoming migrants, but also the needs of their current residents. So I think that my capstone started because I really saw that there was an opportunity and a threat for cities. The opportunity being that with the growing migrant population, there's an opportunity for economic development, but the threat being that you really need to be able to proactively and equitably plan for this growth to meet the needs of, again, like the current and the new residents, and that's been the focus of my research. I started with identifying 5 areas that I was curious about exploring more and learning more about, but for this topic, I actually want to focus on the last 3. I'm going to skip through some of this because I know some of my colleagues on the panel are going to cover a lot more in detail than I could. But the first being, I wanted to look at climate gentrification because I kept hearing concerns about it. As people are moving, what happens to the current residents? But I do think that there is an opportunity here. When you think about climate migration, we heard from Hannah this morning about how a lot of the conversation has been in the Great Lakes region, and those are also the Rust Belt and legacy cities. And those cities, they need population growth. And so while there is this fear of climate gentrification, which is true because as wealthier and well-resourced populations are the first moving voluntarily, they're looking to areas that are already well established and ready to accept incoming migration. There are cities in the Rust Belt that have lost population as a result of lost industry and globalization over the past several decades, and they are actively looking to grow their populations. And so this is an opportunity for them to be able to step into the receiving community's role and really take in a larger population. And what risks still exist can be accounted for by proactive planning policies, and I'll get into that a little bit more later, but I also wanted to talk about what the threats of climate mobility are for cities. So without proper planning, it can lead to housing, racial, and socioeconomic inequalities, but at the same time, you do need to have people in order to grow your local economy. And so in migration, particularly in the climate resilient areas, are an opportunity to boost local economies. And it's also important to recognize that economic revitalization is often associated with and driven by migrant populations in the first place. So investing in amenities, housing, and services that cater to new residents can help stimulate the local markets and enhance the attractiveness of a region, bringing in more private sector investment and continuing that cycle of attracting new residents, new investments, new private sector influence. So the positive I took away from this is we're still ahead of some of the mass movement. Ira mentioned this morning the trickle versus the flood, and we're still in the trickle, and we're moving very quickly towards the flood, but we are, I believe, still in that zone of opportunity to where we can start educating planners and mayors and other city officials and really get them to push for inclusive and proactive planning and get ahead of some of the migration movement. The other thing I talked about was the need for inter and intergovernmental coordination, and we also talked about this a little bit earlier. We are in a new administration. The Inflation Reduction Act was a really great opportunity, and we saw a lot of government agencies work together in ways that they previously had not, and unfortunately that is under threat now, and in a time when we really need federal leadership on climate migration, it's looking like we're not going to have that for the next 4 years. Luckily, so I do work at C40 cities, and one thing that I've really seen from talking to mayors across both the C40 membership in the United States, but also climate mayors and the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, is that mayors are 100% signed on. They understand their role, they understand the urgency, and they are going to continue acting on climate regardless of what the federal leadership is saying. And so we have cities that are committed, and we need to find ways to create that coordination network and the peer sharing between those cities so that they can continue to engage and move forward regardless of the federal leadership on the issue. So at first I was a little worried about this one, but honestly I think we're going to be able to keep moving forward, and I'm excited by that opportunity. I'm going to skip the case study because we did hear from Hannah earlier about some of, and a lot of it is similar, and I really wanted to focus more on what the role of planners is. I spoke at the APA National Capital Chapter Conference earlier, not this year, last year, and there's still a need for educating planners on what climate migration is and what their role is. In a lot of places, in a lot of cities, planning and sustainability departments are separate, and there is an interaction between the two. So there is still like a need for bringing the different departments together, getting them to interact and think about what their role is in response to one another. And so I identified 7 areas specifically where planners need to be involved in the process. First being developing inclusive policies such as zoning, land use, and housing to accommodate increased populations and promote equity. This is increasing housing density, encouraging mixed-use development, reducing barriers to affordable housing development. A lot of this is on the legal side, and there are some cities that are doing some very innovative things and looking to get ahead of it by preemptively changing some of their policies. And so, again, that's a really great opportunity for peer sharing among cities. Building more affordable and adequate housing. I heard from the mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, Brett Smiley, and when you're thinking about receiving communities, the Mayor Smiley is well aware that there's a lot of people moving to Providence, Rhode Island, and a lot of it is because of climate change. They're trying to get away from the heat. A lot of people moving from places like Arizona and California. But housing supply is one of the leading friction points for cities when they're thinking about trying to become a receiving community and welcoming new immigration. So we need to increase affordable housing development through public-private partnerships, inclusionary zoning, and incentives for developers. Also looking at adaptive reuse of buildings or temporary or transitional housing that could help alleviate some of the stress. The third point being that we know that climate destination cities are still at risk. We know there was flooding in Vermont. We know that there was a hurricane that hit Asheville. So no city is 100% safe from climate risks. And so even if you have destination cities that are more risk averse, you still need to plan for infrastructure resilience through your transportation, water, and energy systems, and make sure that they're climate resilient as well. expanding public services such as healthcare, education, public safety, and social services, and facilitating social integration. I'm blanking on the country right now, but I do know, I believe it was, it might be Colombia actually, and they are working on creating resilience hubs, but specifically for climate migration. So trying to bring in all the services that a climate migrant would need to establish themselves in a new city and putting it in one place, and it doubles as a resilience hub in events that it's necessary. But there's a lot of cities that we can learn from globally on that are already facing climate migration far more severe and for far longer than the U.S. has. Economic opportunities, working with economic development agencies to ensure access to job opportunities and small business support. Engaging communities in planning, that includes both migrant and current residents to promote equity. And then finally, promoting sustainable urban growth. So while your city is growing, we know a lot more now about compact transit-oriented development than we did decades ago. And so making sure that we are not forgetting that we need to still be looking to sustainable growth rather than just trying to accommodate any growth at all. And so if you're a planner or if you've been engaged in the planning world at all, you know that none of this is new. It's all stuff that we've been doing for a while now. But it's about shifting that mindset and really thinking about it in the context of climate migration that needs to be further explored and providing those opportunities to planners to both learn about this, but also to city officials to be able to talk to one another and see what other cities are working on to address incoming migration. So I truly think cities have a really vital role in preparing for climate migration, and adopting these strategies can help manage and really leverage some of the opportunities as opposed to the risks. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Andy. That was so informative, and it's great to have you in the network here at GW working on these issues. It's I think, as Donna noted earlier in the event today, it's just such a wealth of resources around GW, and my relationship with Nidhi is an example of that. She just had coffee with me one day, like a year ago, and we just started connecting on these issues and learning a lot from each other. And interestingly, the next presenter is another example of that. I gave a keynote at University of Florida in October that was hosted by UF's Urban and Regional Planning School, and that further deepened my appreciation for the world of planning and how lawyers need to work even more closely than ever with planners on this issue of climate migration receiving communities. So it's great to have Jacob with us from Gainesville, Florida, also working on a master's degree in urban and regional planning, and very much immersed in this space. So, Jacob.
Thank you. Okay, let me pull up the presentation. Okay, from the beginning. Fantastic. So, love to say thank you all for having me. Thank you for inviting me. This is really just such an honor. I mean, just to echo what everyone else has said. I will say from the get-go, this is going to be a little, so my master's thesis is on modeling climate migration. I think creating predictive models is a useful tool, not that they're necessarily capitally accurate, but that they're a useful tool for envisioning future possibilities. That said, this presentation is a little light on specific modeling methodology. If you want to get into the nuts and bolts of that, happy to talk about that during the Q&A session. I just wanted to preempt that. I'll try to go through these slides relatively quickly. So let's kind of start with why do people move? In Hannah's presentation, there was a little bit of talk about kind of pulling from existing migration dynamics, and I think that's a really important place to start. So in short, it's complicated. We know that migration pressures are heterogeneous, so different groups are going to respond to different pressures, going to have different drivers, look for different amenities. Broadly, the research suggests that essentially, political, demographic, environmental, economic, and social factors coalesce in various ways and impact, different groups to make decisions about migration. That's, kind of, if you know anything about migration theory, that should be self-obvious, but just kind of as a starter, people move for different reasons. However, despite the fact that people move for different reasons, and there are these effects are very disaggregated, very heterogeneous, I think broadly what we see in terms of not just climate migration, I mean all migration, is there's kind of 4 broad cohorts of migrants. Those who want to move and who can move, mobile populations. I think like, young professionals moving to a new city. Those who might have the resources to move but don't want to, maybe think like a young family who just settled down. Those who don't want to move and they can't move. So you might think like a lower income lower income household in a city, but they like where they are and they're not like at risk of anything. And then you might have those who want to move and those who can't move. So you might call them trapped. You might think maybe a farmer who just had their whole property destroyed by a hurricane and they don't have the capital to move because their entire net worth was kind of wrapped up in that asset that's now entirely devalued. So I think when thinking about climate migration, both at the kind of receiving end, but also the donation end, it's really important to recognize that like when we're talking about the people coming to cities, we're really only talking about this top right corner, right? We're talking about the mobile populations. And then there's like the rooted, the trapped, the settled populations left behind that also need to be accounted for. So just, some non-exhaustive, and I apologize, it's a little Florida-centric, that's where I practice right now, but just some examples, and this is kind of what I was talking about. Wealthier households will be able to move, we have already talked about that. Wealthier households may not want to move. I mean, essentially everything I talked about. Really, wealth is a huge corollary factor here. Climate change is seldom the only reason people migrate. It's often more like pouring lighter fuel onto pre-existing pressures. So what you'll see is, communities with wealth will move, and communities without wealth will stay and be trapped. And so you kind of see this potentially worsening divide of the haves and the have-nots when thinking about climate migration. But it's also important to note that these are not like fixed categories. People can move in between. If you move and then you like where you are, you might become settled. If you lost resources, you might become rooted, etc. These are all kind of flexible categories, and different groups will change. And I think from a policy perspective, what's really important is this kind of moving people from trapped to mobile. If people want to move but they can't, that's really important because there's going to be a lot of stranded assets. In Florida, where I live, there is a ton of coastal real estate, and most of the state is in a flood zone. A lot of people, their only real asset is their house, and once the kind of price of climate change gets factored into that house, or else their house gets destroyed and they can't rebuild because they can't get insurance, they're left without any assets. And so, you're going to have these populations across the country that may want to move but will not have the resources to do so. And I think this is, a conversation about the private property and about the buyouts. Isn't the flip side that like there are going to be people who just by nature of climate change, even if you bought them out at fair market value is nothing. And so we've already seen something that happened in Florida following Hurricane Ian down in Southwest Florida. There was, just an example, there is a retirement community, or was a retirement community called Sunshine Estates. It was Midwest middle-class retirees living in mobile homes. They own land underneath, unusual for mobile home park. But they all bought, the mobile homes are built in like the 80s. They were not above the flood zone, and then Hurricane Ian comes, wipes them out. Rebuilding is going to cost about $300,000. Very few of these people have that money. So most of them moved back with their families in the Midwest, and we saw, while we were there, a Dallas developer buying houses for $50,000 and flipping them for $500. And that's what some of this might look like, and I think that's an important thing to note. So just kind of that broad overview situating you and kind of thinking about climate migrants, not just in the receiving communities, but on all ends of the spectrum. Where do I think the next steps research-wise are? I think what's really important is to get to a place where we can kind of categorize what the broad migration responses are. And so what I mean is, can we look at data and can we say, okay, we know that wealthy people, with bachelor degrees working in finance are likely to make these kind of moves, and people with, XYZ are able to make these kind of moves. We already do this kind of segmentation in other fields. Esri, GIS company, does this with a marketing thing called Tapestry. The Milken Institute has a version of this at the county level for their Community Explorer. There's already work in kind of this clustering of approaches, and I think the next step is doing this for climate migrants. I'm getting a sense of who's where and what they're going to do. And, it's really tragic that we've had these horrible events. We know there are going to be more of them. But if there's one silver lining in recent tragedies, Hurricane Milton, Hurricane Helene, lost the LA fires, in all the other disasters we've seen is that there's a lot of data that's about to happen about migration. We're going to be able to track in real time where did people go and why did they go there. Most researchers in planning will use things like the American Community Survey, which is kind of a aggregated level. There is a possibility to get access to direct census data through some specific centers. And that might be the next approach, which is really getting into the nitty-gritty of the census data and creating these kind of migration typologies. And then from there, kind of using that to predict who's at risk, where are people likely to go. And that is my presentation. I apologize, that was kind of a, moving through it fast.
Thanks very much, Jacob. And we're going to hear next from, I really appreciated that perspective as well. More of that social science kind of angle on things is always refreshing for a lawyer, and particularly all that data that you've aptly noted that we're going to be able to do a lot with all these major disaster events, and where those folks are going to be moving and why is going to be hugely informative. And my sense is it's going to be driven quite significantly by economic means. When you think about the LA wildfires, I just fear that most of those people are just going to rebuild. They have the money to, and the idea is we need to get away from the threats at the coast and near the wildfires, and hopefully there's going to be some lessons learned about that, to the extent it's revisiting disasters a few years down the road, and using some way of policy interjecting into this process so everyone benefits in a way that's going to be a win-win for keeping people out of harm's way and also building communities elsewhere. So Brianna is our last speaker, and she's another example of these cross-campus resources. We connected. I think she attended one of my lectures on the main campus, and we've stayed in touch ever since. She's been a great resource on supporting Ira's work and adaptation leader, doing some research for me, and just a very, very engaged student on so many levels, and as an honor student at our International Affairs School here at GW. And she's very involved in this topic as well. So, Brianna, you're next.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dean Abate, for the very kind introduction. As you mentioned, my name is Brianna Crossman. I am a sophomore at the Elliott School studying international affairs. And with that, I kind of wanted to give an acknowledgement that my experience is significantly less than my peers on this panel. A majority of my coursework deals with theories of international relations, diplomatic history, etc. But that being said, I'm very excited to be entering this climate research space and to share my research with all of you today. So my research was done under Ira Feldman at Adaptation Leader. It focused on what was called the current state of play, or Section 2 of the Research and Policy Agenda. And to help understand the framework under which the paper would proceed, I tried to answer three main questions, which were: what is climate migration and why is it important? What are some of the struggles that climate migrants face? And then what strategies can communities and governments implement to prepare for climate migrants? And my research drew on the previous work of policymakers Catherine Mack, A.R. Siders, Anna Morandi, Kelly Leilani, Hannah Teicher, who is here today, Patrick Marchman, Yuki Hinu, Christopher Fields, and of course, James May and Ira Feldman. And I want to thank them all for their fantastic contributions to this research space. So in response to the first question, what is climate migration and why is it important? I don't doubt that the people in this room are very well aware of the importance, but I feel as though it is an oft ignored element of the climate crisis, especially absent from discussions of domestic national policy here in the US. We lack a cohesive framework to prepare receiving communities and coordinate a national response for climate displacement. And this is, as noted by others, not a problem of the future, it's a current reality for many. So in 2018 alone, nearly 1.2 million Americans were displaced by weather-related disasters, but this number is expected to surge to 13 million people by 2100. And while extreme weather events like hurricanes have historically been the most visible and destructive elements of the climate crisis, gradual phenomena such as rising sea levels, prolonged droughts, and extreme heat will also drive future displacement. And at risk of displacement are the more than 40% of Americans living in coastal areas. I myself grew up in California, that are vulnerable to rising sea levels. Additionally, there are many millions of Americans who are currently living and moving to the Sun Belt in the South, which we know will be facing extreme temperatures today and in the future years. And as the climate crisis continues, disasters may also proceed in unexpected ways, further endangering the homes and lives of Americans. In spite of the massive risks posed to large swaths of the population, there are few people who are eager to relocate. Even in the most optimal circumstances, relocation is difficult. Relocation can disrupt traditional ways of life and separate communities from culturally important locations. Yet remaining in a deteriorating environment can also cause adverse psychological impacts to communities. So what can be done to address the stresses that migrants will face for social, political, and economic reasons? As noted by Hannah Teicher and Patrick Marchman, climate migration can be a key opportunity to promote equity and right historical wrongs. Legacies of forced resettlements of minority communities can be addressed through reparations, preservation of cultural sites, or facilitating ecosystem migration equitably. Since low-income and minority communities living on small islands or rural coastlines often lack the public resources necessary for relocation, it is important to consider their needs first in devising migration plans. Therefore, in practice, histories of housing discrimination, environmental degradation, and other traumas must be considered first, as policymakers should attempt to provide clear pathways of migration while minimizing the adverse effects of forced relocation. So that leads me to my third and perhaps most important research question, which is how can governments, communities, and individuals proactively prepare for climate migration? It is abundantly clear, as others have discussed today, that successful climate migration will require extensive preparation and coordination, and there are virtually no pockets of America that will be unaffected by migration, whether it be from people moving out, through, or into different regions across the country. Therefore, multi-level governance and a comprehensive plan for receiving communities and migrants is needed. Climate migrants will inevitably seek refuge in areas less vulnerable to the climate crisis, regardless of local sentiments. But a more proactive approach would allow for specific receiving communities to be open to climate migrants based on a few key factors. Ideal receiving communities would possess a reliable source of fresh water, affordable housing, robust infrastructure, a lower susceptibility to climate stressors, and a demonstrated history of resilience and adaptability. However, as most areas of the U.S. already face their own environmental stresses that will be aggravated by the climate crisis, the process of designating these receiving communities may be politically fraught. Therefore, though some cities may fit the criteria of being receiving communities, the first qualifier of a city being recognized as a climate haven should be the positive attitudes of locals towards migrants and the necessary investments that it takes to accommodate them. Research done by Hino, Fields, and Mack found that situations in which both parties, residents and migrants, are supportive of retreat, greater benefits are accrued to the broader society. If residents are not supportive of migration or lack the political will to implement strategies, the societal benefit-cost ratio may not justify relocation. In these cases, the societal cost can be too high to migrants who have just left their homes and to residents who feel a burden of accepting newcomers into their communities. Therefore, reciprocal integration, in which both hosts and migrants are allowed to voice their opinions on migration, is a key to sustainable integration and the mitigation of tensions between populations. But thankfully, many cities have already been eager to brand themselves as climate havens for a variety of reasons. An example previously brought up was Buffalo. In 2019, Mayor Byron Brown proclaimed that Buffalo would be a refuge city for centuries to come. Why? Since 2017, Buffalo has received thousands of climate migrants from Puerto Rico following the devastation of Hurricane Maria. Buffalo's affordable housing, bilingual education, and availability of jobs led many to choose to stay permanently, which filled the extensive vacancies in urban housing and stimulated the economy. In Cincinnati, Ohio, climate migration due to Hurricane Katrina also spurred an interest in becoming a receiving community. Cincinnati adopted a green plan in 2018 that provided an outline of how the city would prepare for climate migration through measures like low-carbon transportation and investments in urban health. Other cities that have a desire to welcome climate migrants can follow these examples to prepare. Ensuring that these communities enhance their capacity to accommodate incoming migrants while maintaining their own sustainability practices will be crucial for managing the challenges of climate-induced displacement effectively. Given the current administration, I have less faith in a coordinated federal response to climate migration, but I still have hope that preparation efforts will continue on the local and regional levels. Though climate justice initiatives may face an uphill battle during these unprecedented times, it's important to remember that there are many millions of people still hoping to see change within their communities and are willing to invest the time and resources it takes to welcome climate migrants across the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Brianna.
about. I share your skepticism about progress at the federal level.